It happens all the time. You're in a Dynasty startup, you feel like you're making good picks, but then looking back at the final roster, you feel somewhat disappointed. Well, this exact same thing happened to one of my Discord members, Dynasty Dimes. So today we are going to be talking through Dynasty startup strategy, specifically 12-team Superflex leagues, but these principles will carry over to different formats and different league sizes. Dynasty Dimes and I were chatting in the Discord about a startup draft that he was recently in. And although Dimes felt like he had made good picks throughout the draft, looking back at the final roster, he just felt underwhelmed by the team that he had made. And so we'll get started here by taking a look at Dynasty Dimes draft. But before that, I just want to say that we will be going through multiple drafts, multiple rosters, and none of this is supposed to be mean, not looking down on anyone, not trying to call anyone out, just trying to look at ways that good Dynasty managers can improve, can optimize their drafts, right? Here we have Dynasty Dimes' draft board, the league settings, and then Dimes was drafting out of the 111 spot. And so the first thing is that I don't think there were any particularly bad picks in this draft for Dynasty Dimes. Like, I actually think there were several very good picks at price, including Gibbs, Mahomes, Dak Prescott, Kenneth Walker, and Daniel Jones. And so, if anything, I'd say that on average, the pick selection was pretty good, was above average. And so, what really went wrong here? Well, the problem is going Gibbs and Bowers up top in those first two rounds, because as we can see, the falling values in this draft and in many drafts in these middle rounds are quarterback, tight end, and running back. It's hard to get really good deals on wide receivers in the middle rounds. Of course, it can happen, but it's just more difficult. And we saw that this is how the draft played out for Dynasty Dimes. He got good values on Mahomes, Prescott, and Kenneth Walker, and McConkey was a very solid pick at price. But what happened is that he got through the first 6 rounds and then only had one wide receiver. And then that forced 4 wide receiver picks out of the next 4 draft selections that Dynasty Dimes could make, and picking up wide receivers in ranges where there were likely better picks at price, where he could have gotten more value. And so what this comes down to is opportunity cost. The opportunity cost for taking Gibbs and Bowers up top wasn't really very optimized, where it would have been better to potentially take wide receiver at the top of the draft and then get better deals on the running back and tight end position in the later rounds. The problem here is that Dynasty Dimes drafted passively, and that led to poorly utilizing opportunity cost. I'll talk a little bit more about optimizing opportunity cost in a moment, but first I want to hit on passive drafting, because it's a trap that many managers fall into, one that I've fallen into multiple times myself, where you only focus on the next 1 or 2 picks in front of you, and you don't necessarily think about how those first couple of picks in your draft are going to influence and limit your picks throughout the rest of the draft. Of course, just drafting the best value at every single pick, in theory, isn't a bad strategy at all. But what that does is it makes the draft completely dependent on what players fall back to you, essentially putting the outcome of your dynasty draft into the hands of the 11 or so other managers in your league. A passive approach can turn out just fine, as long as the right players fall back to you. However, it puts you at risk of getting punished if those players do not find their way back to you throughout the draft. That is why I have made the switch to active drafting, and now I never leave a startup disappointed. My goal is to hit 500 subscribers by the end of February. I know it's a tall order, it's going to be tough, but that is the goal that I've set for myself. So if you all could help me out, if you enjoy the content, subscribe. I would love to hit 500 subscribers by the end of the month. Hopping back over to opportunity cost, going into a startup, the value of each team's picks are basically equal. Maybe some draft positions are slightly better than others, hypothetically, but these are minute differences. It's a pretty level playing field. So you might think that the best way to get an advantage over your league mates is to just draft the highest value player at each draft pick. Thus, you'll have slightly more value than your league mates heading out of the startup draft. However, I challenge that. I actually think that the best way to get an advantage over your league mates out of a startup is to maximize your opportunity cost, essentially getting the most bang for your buck out of every pick in the startup draft that you possibly can. You might not believe me, and that's totally fine. So let's go through a real practical example of this from the mock draft that I live streamed last week. And we're going to focus in here on teams 2 and teams 3. And I think this is just a really good example because these two teams exemplify value versus opportunity cost, and they're right back to back on the draft board. So Team 3 starts out with wide receiver early, Jamar Chase and Drake London, while Team 2 goes Josh Allen and Brock Bowers. So Team 2 has taken the hypothetically more valuable players, and Team 3 has taken the wide receivers, which I would say are better players for opportunity cost purposes. And so the impact that these picks have heading into these middle rounds, Team 3 is able to take Dak Prescott in the 5th round because they don't have two quarterbacks and they're set at wide receiver, where Team 2 is taking Luther Burden. Similar concept in the 7th round, where the Team 3 has wide receiver figured out, and so they can take Javonte Williams, a good value, a good opportunity cost type player. And then Team 2 is taking Ricky Pearsall. And so although I think that Team 2 has done a better job optimizing their roster's raw value throughout this draft, I look at it and I just really, really like the team that Team 3 has put together. And it all comes down to opportunity cost. Enough bearing the lead, here is a chart of what positions I believe are good opportunity costs depending on the round. And so this isn't this specific player is a good price in this round. There is multiple players at this position that you are likely to be able to draft in that round that are good opportunity costs. And so the first 2 rounds, I mean, they're all cornerstone assets. There's not really a better deal on a certain position in these first 2 rounds relative to the other players. Moving into the next couple of rounds, we have quarterback, which is just by far and away the best value at cost in the 3rd round. You have guys like Justin Herbert, Patrick Mahomes, Brock Purdy, Bo Nix, and more. And so you are very likely going to be able to select a quarterback in the 3rd round that is a good value. And then moving to round 4 and round 5, maybe if some of these quarterbacks fall into the 4th round, you can get some more good values. But really, it's dominated by running back position in these 4th and 5th rounds. Moving into the 6th and 7th rounds, we have really good values on some of these young tight ends like Harold Fannin, Gadsden, Kraft, players like that. And it continues to be good values for running back too. Guys like Josh Jacobs, Kyron Williams, Javonte Williams. And then going into rounds 8 and 9, really it's a free-for-all. We kind of go back to like any position. All positions are sort of equal. There weren't any particular positions that stood out to me in this range. And then the like 10th, 11th round, I think, is where the wide receiver position finally comes back around and you can get some good values. Also, good values on quarterbacks, those like QB3 uncertain types in this range. And then rounding out with round 12 is where you can pick up one of those later round tight ends, maybe a Jake Ferguson, a Dallas Goedert. And so looking back up at these first 2 rounds, you can take any position here. And for those like top 24 players, I don't think you are necessarily better off taking any one position or another. However, when we include the context that there are certain players that are better at value in these middle rounds, we can see the distinct absence of the wide receiver position as good values in these later rounds. You have to wait all the way until rounds 10 or 11 until the wide receiver position is actually like a good deal at price. What this means is that it's advantageous to start out going wide receiver in these early rounds because you are just more likely to find these good values at other positions. Using this knowledge on these pockets of value that you can find later in drafts, we can come up with a plan that you can implement from the very beginning. And planning ahead is how you move from a passive drafter over to an active drafter. And so the optimal strategy using all this information is going to be centered around taking wide receiver early in those first 2 to 3 rounds, even sometimes forcing a wide receiver pick while there's more valuable players left on the board. And again, of course, before we get into this, I'm simply presenting my advice, what I believe is the best startup strategy right now. You are free to use that advice. You're also free to not use it. You do whatever is going to be the most fun for you playing Dynasty, because it's a game and that's what it's all about. But if you do want to try and optimize how you perform in startup drafts, then go ahead and take this advice and implement it as much or as little as you like. The strategy is going to be dependent on where you are picking from in the startup draft. And so we're going to start out with picks 1 through 6 and have the same strategy for this section. Round 1, the recommendation is going to be force wide receiver no matter what. I don't care if Drake May is on the board. I don't care if Bijan's on the board, Josh Allen. I don't care, because there is no guarantee that one of those top 8 Dynasty wide receivers is going to fall back to you if you are picking from one of these early round positions. And what we really want to avoid is leaving these first 2 rounds without at least one wide receiver. And then if a Drake London, Justin Jefferson, or one of these players falls back to you in the first part of this draft, even better. That's even better. Because when we go back and we think about what happened with Team 2 in that mock draft that I showed you, where they didn't take wide receiver early and then had to play catch up in the middle rounds. And then we combine that with what we know about opportunity cost and the different value pockets later in the draft. If you leave the first few rounds without wide receiver, then the best values throughout those middle rounds of the draft are unlikely to be wide receiver. It's likely to be other positions. And so what we want to avoid is having to play catch up at the wide receiver position in those middle rounds, because you can get so much of a better value on the other positions most of the time, most consistently, in those middle to late rounds. And really, the difference in value between whatever wide receiver 1 or wide receiver 2, whoever the top dynasty wide receiver is for you, let's just say JSN, the difference between JSN and Bijan, JSN and Drake May, any of these players is pretty minute. Of course, you can prefer certain players over other positions, right? Like I would prefer the cornerstone QBs, those top 3 or 4 guys, generally over the top wide receiver, the top running back. But there's just a very small, minute difference in the value and the insulation and the production of these first and second round cornerstone players. And so then moving into round 2, what I would suggest is either take any falling value at the wide receiver position. So any of those top 8 dynasty wide receivers, if they're still available, you just hit that draft button on the wide receiver. And then if there's no wide receiver, then just take the best value available. Round 3, we're going to go back to the wide receiver position. If there is a wide receiver in the same tier of players available, even if you already have 2 wide receivers. And of course, if there are no wide receivers in the current tier, then just take the best value available. Most of the time, the best value is going to be one of those quarterbacks. And then for rounds 4 through 7, just continue to look for whatever values are falling at the running back, quarterback, and tight end position. And then once we reach rounds 8 through 12, you should have a relatively balanced and flexible roster at this point in the draft and be able to take whatever the best value available is. If this video is making you want to join a startup draft and get drafting in a new Dynasty League, check out my Discord, where I will be randomly drawing members to join a Dynasty startup draft with myself that will be live streamed on this channel. Next, we have picks 6 through 12, which is going to have a similar but slightly different strategy. And so for round 1, I would still recommend picking wide receiver first, because that gives you the opportunity to go double wide receiver through the first and second round. However, I will say you do not need to force a wide receiver pick in the first round if you are one of these later picks, because you are very, very likely to then have one of those top 8 dynasty wide receivers fall back to you in the second round, just because of, the ADP, how the numbers work. And so here, if you're at the 107, 108, and there's a Bijan available, there's a Gibbs available, go ahead and draft them. Maybe there's falling value at the quarterback position, and you can get a Lamar late in the first round, or a Jaden Daniels late in the first round. And I'm totally fine with that. And that's because here in the second round, if you did not draft a wide receiver in round 1, you have the ability to force a wide receiver pick here in the second round. And so that is what I would recommend doing. And then again, strongly would recommend taking a second wide receiver, even if you took a wide receiver in round 1. But again, if you took a wide receiver in round 1, then you at least have one of those anchor wide receivers, and you can take falling value at another position if you really want to. And then in round 3, and on, it's really just going to look similar to the 1 through 6 strategy, where in round 3, if there is a wide receiver in the same tier as some other positional players, then just take the wide receiver. If there are players at other positions in a tier above the wide receiver position, then just take the value at those other positions. Again, that value is most likely to be at the quarterback position. And then in rounds 4 through 7, again, just look for falling values at the running back, quarterback, and tight end position to fill out your team. And in rounds 8 through 12, take whatever falling value you can, because if you follow this strategy, then you will have a balanced or at least flexible roster heading into this section of the draft. And so the advantage with this strategy really is maintaining flexibility. But Levi, the strategy isn't that flexible. You're saying I have to draft wide receiver in the first 1 or 2 rounds of the draft. And this is a great point. The goal is to be flexible into the middle and late rounds of the startup draft, because that is where you can get the most value gains out of falling value. And so drafting for raw value, not only might you miss out on getting good values in these later rounds, you might actually be forced to take bad values. And so the manager who was drafting at the 1 spot in the mock draft took Drake May at the 101, good value. Ashton Jeanty at the 212, another good value. But then the wide receiver position, there was just no falling value coming back to this manager, and they were getting worried about filling out the wide receiver position, which is totally understandable. And they end up reaching on Rome Odunze. And I don't love the pick. It's definitely a reach, but I don't think that this was really necessarily like a bad move by the manager, because they could have very easily been left out to dry with the wide receiver picks. Because if we look down the draft, wide receiver value continued to not fall in this manager's direction, taking Devontae Smith at the 512, not a bad pick, but not a good value. And then Jaden Higgins at the 8-1, which I think is honestly a little bit of a reach, but again, just trying to get any wide receiver value that could fall back to him. There's even a chance, however small, that Rome Odunze, who's being drafted in the mid to late 5th round in a lot of these drafts, could have fallen back to him at the 512. And so even if, you're a Rome Odunze believer, a Rome Odunze stand, this is just definitely a reach of a pick where this manager took a bad value in order to secure a wide receiver in this 3rd round. Now, I know that many of you are probably thinking, well, I still want a value max in my drafts. I'm not quite bought into this opportunity cost argument that you're making. And so I want to go through a couple more examples of different drafts. And so we're going to have 3 different drafts where this passive drafting, or this drafting only for value, is kind of the main focus on what the manager is doing. And so the first one is going to be an example where this passive drafting really did not work out in the manager's favor. And so here we have a manager who was drafting at the 112. They started out with Ashton Jeanty, and then actually traded up from their 2nd pick to get Trey McBride at the 110. And the player that was actually picked here at the 201 was Amon-Ra St. Brown. And then we have Justin Herbert, Breece Hall, Tucker Kraft, Kyle Pitts, Kyron Williams, Derrick Henry in the 8th round, and then Christian Watson at the 9-1 as their first wide receiver. Then they go back to the tight end well and take TJ Hawkinson before going Wan'Dale Robinson in the 11th and Chuba Hubbard in the 12th round. A bunch of these are just really good value picks. However, when we finish up and look at this roster, it is not very pretty. This team in particular is really poorly constructed, considering that this is a 12-team start 11 superflex, 6-point per passing touchdown, where you have to start 3 wide receivers and only 1 tight end. There is a 0.75 tight end premium. And so knowing that, this manager has not only punted the quarterback position, drafting only Justin Herbert through the first 12 rounds, they're going to have to stack a bunch of these high upside quarterback picks into the later draft if they want to secure a starting quarterback for next season. And then they also have to start 3 wide receivers. So we're at the 12th round, and they still have a wide receiver slot that isn't filled. And although Christian Watson and Wan'Dale Robinson are certainly players with upside, these aren't guys that I want being my wide receiver 1 and wide receiver 2 heading into the 2026 season. I mean, what happens if the Giants add another receiving weapon and Wan'Dale Robinson is next to useless for fantasy purposes and Christian Watson gets hurt again? And you're left with like 3 empty spots at the wide receiver position and these tight ends and running backs just sitting on your bench that you can't even slot into your lineup. And I know what you're thinking. We're 8 months away from when we have to put together a starting lineup. But the problem is that if you put your roster into such a dire situation like this manager has, then it's hard to dig yourself out of a hole. And so this manager has done what I call drafting themselves into a hole, because they have such little value at the wide receiver position that everyone in their league knows that they have a need at wide receiver. And so even if this manager goes, okay, I have Trey McBride and some other tight ends that I'm comfortable with, I need a wide receiver, let me move Trey McBride for a high-end wide receiver. Well, the other managers in your league, not only have they already constructed their rosters in a way that they would like to throughout the start of draft, they also have leverage over you, over like this manager, because they have drafted themselves into so deep of a hole. They have to make trades realistically in order to field a functioning starting roster. And so the other managers in your league, if they are smart, are going to say, no, I'm definitely not going to trade one of my high-end wide receivers for Trey McBride at like a 1-to-1 price. I'm going to want an overpay because I have leverage over you, because you have a significant need. And so if this manager would have just drafted Amon-Ra St. Brown, not traded up to the 110 to get Trey McBride, then they would have enough wide receiver value that maybe the other managers in your league didn't feel like they had a bunch of leverage. However, because this manager traded up, took Trey McBride, and punted the wide receiver position so far in a start 3 wide receiver league, they have just really put themselves into a hole and have to make trades in order to dig themselves out of it. Now, on a lighter note, let's look at the second example where the manager was drafting for value as well, but things worked out a little bit better for them. And so we have Team 5 from my mock draft here. Drafted Bijan Robinson up top in the first round, and then went Jalen Hurts, James Cook, Travion Henderson, A.J. Brown in the 5th, and then Jordan Love in the 6th. So good value on these first 6 picks. However, this manager drafted only one wide receiver in the first 6 rounds. But then looking at the rest of the draft, we have Jameson Williams at the 7-9, which honestly is a pretty good value for JMO, and then getting Wan'Dale Robinson and Jacoby Myers in the 10th and 11th round. And so the difference between this draft and the previous one is that they have A.J. Brown and Jameson Williams before they kind of get to those late round wide receivers. And so not only do they just have extra shots at the wide receiver position to pan out, but they also have 2 guys that were pretty confident that they are going to be productive, at least to some degree. And so this is one where it worked out fairly well. The manager was able to secure enough wide receiver value fell to him that he was able to field a relatively balanced roster. But again, we see that A.J. Brown fell to the 5-9. Some drafts, A.J. Brown is going significantly higher. And so if Brown hadn't been available at the 5-9 when this manager was on the clock, then this very easily could have been much more comparable to that first roster. And then for our third example, we have a manager who kind of punted the wide receiver position in the first 3 rounds, but things really worked out for them. And so things can absolutely go really well for these passive drafts, for these managers who draft passively. However, it's just much riskier. So we have this manager going Jaden Daniels, Omarion Hampton, and James Cook with those first 3 picks. Again, I think those are all really good values at those selections. But then the key here is that they had really good wide receiver value fall back to them multiple points in the draft. We have Rashee Rice falling back at the 4-3, BTJ at the 5-10, and T. Higgins at the 6-3. Not only that, but this manager also gets an excellent value on Devontae Adams at the 10-3. In some of these drafts, I see Adams going as early as like the 7th, 8th round. And I won't pull it up, but if we go back and we look at this entire draft board, Rashee Rice was like the last wide receiver in that tier, and it just really happened to align and fall back really well for this manager. Same thing with Brian Thomas, like last wide receiver in that tier, happened to fall back, and same thing with T. Higgins. And of course, Devontae Adams fell super far in this draft. And so things worked out very well for this manager, but it wasn't necessarily that this manager drafted really skillfully. It's that the wide receiver value just kind of happened to fall back in the perfect alignment for this manager to get excellent wide receiver value in these middle rounds, which is absolutely not something that will happen for your drafts consistently. I already know that there's people heading down to the comments section to give the second most common critique, which is production, because this strategy is suggesting passing over more productive assets like Drake May, Josh Allen, Bijan Robinson for hypothetically less productive assets in those top dynasty wide receivers. And I know that this is counterintuitive, but drafting for production does not equal drafting a more productive roster. So let me explain. For the wide receiver position, the most productive assets at that position are those wide receivers going in the first 3 rounds of dynasty startups. Of course, maybe a George Pickens or Chris Olave, someone like that falls into the beginning of the 4th, but most of the time, those players are going in the first 3 rounds or just the beginning, very beginning of the 4th round. And so the only other way to get a player that we can actually have confidence in, giving us like 18 plus points per game at the wide receiver position, is going to be A.J. Brown, Mike Evans, Devontae Adams, and T. Higgins. And so looking at the running back position, we have a ton of players who have very legit 18 plus point per game upside going in these middle rounds. Breece Hall, Kyron Williams, Bucky Irving, Cam Scatterbo, RJ Harvey, Chase Brown, Josh Jacobs, Kenneth Walker, Javonte Williams, Travis Etienne, Derrick Henry. There's a ton of these players that could be low-end RB1s in these later rounds of the draft. And if we want to go even further, you can actually get more production in the third or fourth round at the running back position than you can in the first round, because there's guys like Saquon Barkley, Jonathan Taylor, and Christian McCaffrey there for the taking. It's a similar concept with the quarterback and the tight end positions. And so although the high-end quarterbacks that are drafted in Dynasty are more productive than the quarterbacks that you can get later in the draft, the difference in production between a Josh Allen, Drake May, Jaden Daniels isn't that big between the production of a Dak Prescott, Jared Goff, Baker Mayfield, guys that you can get much later in the draft. And with tight end, it's, again, super similar. Although Bowers and McBride are both guys that are going to be very productive that we can have confidence in, being able to get Tucker Kraft in the mid-sixth round is an incredible value. So the most consistent way to build out a productive roster out of a startup is going to be focusing on the wide receiver position in those first 2 rounds, and then filling out the quarterback, running back, and tight end positions down into the middle and later rounds where you can get better deals for production for price. And you can do all of that while still building just as insulated of a roster as if you had went quarterback early or running back early in these drafts. And so when we actually take all of this into account, the argument for drafting a Bijan or a McBride or whoever over the wide receivers in this range actually pretty much falls apart. Because although you're getting the more productive player in that round, by the end of the draft, you have most likely built a less productive roster than someone who went wide receiver in the early rounds. Bringing everything that we've talked about together, the way to dominate your Dynasty startup drafts is to be an active drafter. It helps with consistency, flexibility by planning ahead, knowing where those pockets of value are so that you can best position yourself early in the draft to get those falling values and to be successful later in the draft. I'd like to introduce an analogy. This analogy is a punt returner. The punt returner doesn't know where the ball is going to land before the snap. And so all the punt returner can do is position themselves optimally on the field for whatever type of kick comes their way. And in the same way, a dynasty manager doesn't know what players are going to fall back to them throughout a draft. But a good dynasty drafter, like a good punt returner, can put themselves in an optimal position early on in order to best handle whatever comes their way later. And so here are the 3 pieces of advice that I want each of you to take into your dynasty drafts in the future. First, don't be a passive drafter. Use your knowledge of value and opportunity cost and ADP to advantageously select different players early in the draft and set yourself up for success later on. Second, the goal should be to maximize flexibility throughout the entire draft so that you can grab those falling values and avoid having to reach on players at specific positions later in the draft. And last, you don't have to pick the highest value player at every pick every single time. It's okay to take a slight value loss on a certain pick in order to avoid a larger value loss later down the draft. And yes, if I was drafting at the 101 in a Dynasty startup draft today, I would be drafting Jamar, JSN, or Puka Nacua with my first pick. As always, thank you guys for being here. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the content, and I'll see you next time.